The summer of 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia, carried with it a strange heaviness. The fields of corn and cotton swayed in the thick humidity, yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of plantation life, something darker pulsed a silent drumbeat that few could sense, but none could have stopped once it began. In this quiet corner of the American South, where the economy thrived on the backs of enslaved men and women, the name Nat Turner was spoken in hushed tones long before blood ever stained the soil. He was known not simply as another enslaved laborer, but as a preacher, a man said to be marked by visions, a figure who believed himself chosen by divine command. And it was this conviction that would turn an ordinary landscape into the theater of one of the bloodiest uprisings in American history. The story begins not with violence, but with whispers. Stories passed between cabins in the dead of night, tales of a man who dreamed of lights in the sky, of voices in the wind, of symbols carved into the sun and moon. These were not the mutterings of a fool, but the warnings of someone believed to be touched by something beyond human understanding. Nat Turner's visions carried weight because they echoed the longing of so many, the unbearable weight of bondage, the dream of deliverance, the desperate hope for a day of reckoning. And in an era when the lash cracked daily and chains clinked, like a rhythm of despair, even the faintest spark of prophecy could ignite dangerous hope. Turner himself was quiet, reserved, yet when he spoke, others listened. He had learned to read and write, a rarity among the enslaved, and the words of the Bible shaped his every thought. In Scripture, he saw not only salvation, but judgment, the promise that oppressors would one day fall beneath the sword of the oppressed. It was a dangerous interpretation in a land ruled by slave codes and fear, yet it resonated deeply. To some, Turner was a prophet. To others, he was a threat waiting to emerge. But no one, not his fellow enslaved, not the white families who thought him harmless, could have predicted the scale of what was coming. On August nights, when the moon glowed pale through the trees, Turner confided in a small circle of men. They gathered in secret, hearts pounding, voices low, sharing in the audacity of what they plotted. The rebellion would not be a single act of defiance, but a storm of vengeance. The plan was simple in its cruelty: to strike suddenly, to show no mercy, to turn the tools of servitude into weapons of liberation. They would begin where Turner knew the landscape best, near the Travis farm, and from there, the violence would spread like wildfire. Yet this is not a tale of sudden madness. It was deliberate, simmering, born of centuries of anguish. The hook of this story lies in its inevitability. When a people are pressed down long enough, when faith becomes intertwined with desperation, when a single man believes he carries the voice of God, the outcome is no longer if, but when. The rebellion of Nat Turner was not just a series of murders. It was the eruption of a suppressed nightmare, a truth America wanted to ignore. For those who lived through it, the days that followed felt like the veil between the living and the dead had been torn away. As dawn broke on August 21st, 1831, the first axe fell. It was not in the heat of battle, nor in defense, but in cold, methodical silence. The rebellion began in whispers and erupted in screams. Entire households were pulled into the frenzy, men, women, and children. The night filled with the sound of doors splintering, of hurried footsteps across wooden floors, of voices cut short in terror. By the time the rebellion was finally crushed, more than 50 white men, women, and children had been killed. Yet the rebellion's true legacy would not be measured in bodies, but in fear, a fear that spread across the South, rewriting laws, tightening chains, and ensuring that Turner's name would be remembered not as a man, but as a specter haunting the history of slavery. And here lies the paradox. Was Nat Turner a prophet fulfilling divine judgment, or a murderer drenched in delusion? The answer depends on where one stands. For the enslaved, he was a glimpse of divine retribution, proof that even in darkness, resistance was possible. For slaveholders, he was a nightmare given flesh, a reminder that control was always fragile, that rebellion could erupt from within their own homes. For us, nearly 2 centuries later, his story forces a confrontation not just with violence, but with the conditions that made violence inevitable. This is where our journey begins. We are about to descend into a world where faith and blood mingled, where prophecy turned to slaughter, and where history recorded the uprising, not in neutral ink, but in the scars it left on a nation already trembling on the fault lines of slavery. The rebellion of Nat Turner was brief, lasting only a matter of days, but the shockwaves it produced would ripple for generations. Tonight, we step back into those fields of Virginia, into the cabins where whispers gave birth to fire, into the shadows where a preacher claimed to hear the voice of God. Tonight, we walk alongside Nat Turner into one of the darkest chapters of American history, where faith, freedom, and fear collided in a storm of blood. To understand the rebellion that Nat Turner led in 1831, we must first step into the soil of Virginia as it was in the early 19th century. This was not merely a backdrop of farms and forests, but a carefully constructed society built on the institution of slavery. In Southampton County, where Turner was born and lived, life was dictated by rhythms of labor, by seasons of planting and harvest, and by the unrelenting hierarchy that placed white landowners at the top and enslaved Africans at the bottom. It was a world where wealth and power depended on bondage, and where every attempt at human dignity among the enslaved was crushed under laws, whips, and chains. Virginia was the birthplace of America's contradictions. It was the land of Thomas Jefferson, who penned the words that all men are created equal, even as his plantation relied on enslaved labor. By 1831, slavery in Virginia was not a fading institution, but a deeply entrenched economic system. Plantations sprawled across the countryside, producing tobacco, cotton, and grain, commodities that tied Virginia not only to the southern states, but to the global economy. Behind every bushel harvested and every bale sold were the hands of enslaved men, women, and children who received no reward for their toil. The prosperity of the few rested squarely on the suffering of the many. Southampton County, in particular, was a patchwork of small and large farms. Unlike the grand plantations of the Deep South, many white families here owned only a handful of enslaved laborers, and some none at all. Yet slavery shaped every interaction, every law, every fear. Even poor white families who owned no slaves clung to the hierarchy it created, for it assured them of their place above the enslaved population. This fragile sense of superiority made them allies to wealthy planters, reinforcing a system that otherwise offered them little material wealth. The enslaved population, meanwhile, grew in number and in silent discontent. By 1830, African Americans made up more than half the county's population. This imbalance bred constant anxiety among white residents, a fear that rebellion could erupt at any moment, that the very people they exploited might rise against them. Religious life added another layer of complexity. The Second Great Awakening, a wave of Protestant revivalism sweeping through America, had reached Virginia. Preachers traveled from town to town, proclaiming salvation and warning of damnation, their voices echoing across wooden churches and open fields. Enslaved people were drawn to these gatherings, finding in Christianity both comfort and a language for liberation. The stories of Exodus, of Moses leading his people out of bondage, carried special weight. Yet slaveholders carefully controlled how the Bible was taught, emphasizing obedience and submission while suppressing verses that hinted at deliverance. Still, in the private moments of prayer and song, the enslaved reinterpreted the gospel, turning it into a quiet theology of resistance. Nat Turner, raised in this religious environment, absorbed not only the scriptures but the belief that God spoke directly to him. His visions were not anomalies in this climate. They were the extreme expression of a culture saturated in religion, suffering, and hope. The laws of Virginia reflected the fears of its white citizens. Slave codes dictated nearly every aspect of enslaved life. They could not gather without supervision, could not learn to read or write, and could not travel freely. These laws were enforced with violence. Whippings were public spectacles, meant not only to punish, but to terrify others into submission. Runaways were hunted with dogs and guns, often returned with scars as warnings. Yet repression only deepened. Resentment. Secret networks of communication developed among the enslaved, carried through songs, stories, and whispered conversations in the night. Though most rebellions were crushed before they began, the possibility lingered. For enslaved communities, rebellion was always a question of opportunity, not desire. The economic strain of the 1820s also played a role. Agricultural prices fluctuated, debts mounted, and many white farmers felt their grip on stability slipping. In such times, scapegoats were easy to find. Enslaved laborers bore the brunt of harsher punishments, tighter controls, and fewer chances for even minor autonomy. Simultaneously, news of uprisings elsewhere circulated, both whispered and in print. Stories of the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved people had overthrown their masters and established a black republic, haunted American slaveholders. For the enslaved, these same stories were glimmers of possibility, proof that the impossible could happen. Even in Virginia, the rebellion of Gabriel Prosser in 1800 and the attempted revolt led by Denmark Vesey in 1822 had shown that organized resistance was within reach. Though both uprisings failed, they left an imprint on the imagination of the enslaved, a sense that one day the balance of power could shift. Southampton itself was geographically isolated, yet deeply connected to these larger currents. Roads wound through thick forests and farmlands, leading to small towns and markets where news traveled faster than most realized. The county was not a world apart, but a microcosm of the South's broader tensions. Dependence on slavery, fear of insurrection, and reliance on religion to maintain order. In this environment, Nat Turner was not simply a lone visionary but a product of his time, shaped by forces larger than himself. His literacy gave him access to ideas most enslaved. People were denied, while his reputation as a preacher granted him influence. His visions, whether divine or delusional, resonated because they spoke to a shared condition: the unbearable contradiction of a society claiming liberty while enforcing bondage. To the enslaved of Southampton, Turner's words might have felt like destiny. To the white population, they would soon feel like a curse. But before the bloodshed began, the county in 1831 was already on edge, already balanced on a knife's edge between control and collapse. The rebellion that erupted was not an accident, nor the isolated madness of a single man. It was the eruption of pressures that had been building for decades: economic exploitation, legal repression, racial terror, and spiritual yearning. Turner lit the match, but the fire had long been waiting. Understanding this history is crucial because it reminds us that violence never arises in a vacuum. The fields of Virginia in 1831 were not simply quiet farms but battlefields in waiting, landscapes scarred by inequality and injustice. The rebellion was a moment when those scars tore open, exposing the raw nerve of a nation that had built its prosperity on human suffering. And though the uprising was crushed, the echoes of its gunfire, its screams and its prayers would reverberate far beyond the borders of Southampton County, shaping the course of American slavery and the debates over freedom for decades to come. It began not with the roar of cannons or the march of armies, but in the quiet of a Sunday evening, when the fields lay cloaked in darkness and only the hum of insects filled the air. On August 21, 1831, Nat Turner and a small circle of trusted men gathered in secrecy. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were enslaved laborers, carrying the weight of centuries of bondage on their shoulders. Their weapons were simple axes, knives, blunt instruments taken from barns and kitchens, but their intent was extraordinary. They believed they were instruments of God, chosen to strike a blow against a system that had robbed them of freedom, dignity, and hope. The first house they approached belonged to the Travis family, where Turner himself had lived and labored. By candlelight, Turner and his men slipped inside, their breaths steady, their faces pale with both resolve and terror. The Travis household, unaware of what was to come, slept soundly. What followed was not a skirmish but a slaughter. The enslaved men struck swiftly, ensuring no witnesses would remain. It was brutal, personal, and silent, no gunshots to alarm the neighbors, only the thud of axes and the muffled cries of victims. In that first moment of bloodshed, the rebellion crossed the line from dream to reality. Turner's visions had demanded sacrifice, and now, in the flicker of lamplight, it had begun. From there, the group moved steadily across Southampton County, their numbers growing as others joined. Some came willingly, inspired by Turner's conviction. Others hesitated, caught between fear of punishment and the lure of liberation. With each stop, the rebellion left more bodies in its wake. Families were torn apart in the night, their houses left in eerie silence after the rebels moved on. The choice of weapons mattered. Knives, hatchets, and farm tools left scenes that were not only violent but intimate, a reversal of the daily power dynamic between enslaver and enslaved. Each act carried symbolic weight. It was not just murder, but a message written in blood, that the system itself was fragile, that the roles could be reversed. As dawn broke, the rebellion took on a new urgency. The countryside was waking, and news began to spread. Word traveled faster than Turner and his men could move, carried by survivors who fled into the woods or across the fields. By mid-morning, rumors of an uprising raced from farm to farm, stoking panic among white residents. Some gathered their families and sought refuge in makeshift forts or churches, while others took up arms, forming militias to confront the rebels. For a brief window of time, however, Turner and his followers held momentum. They moved deliberately, striking households where white families were caught off guard, gathering weapons and supplies as they pressed forward. The scale of the violence shocked even those who participated. Men who had once bent their backs in silent submission now raised their arms in fury, their anger sharpened by years of suffering. The rebellion was not random chaos. It followed a clear trajectory, house by house, mile by mile. Turner himself was not always at the front of the killings, but his presence was undeniable. He carried himself like a prophet, his eyes distant yet burning, as if he were seeing something beyond the immediate carnage. To his followers, he was both leader and seer, guiding them through the night with scripture on his lips and conviction in his voice. Yet the rebellion was never destined to last. By the second day, organized resistance began to close in. Militias formed quickly, bolstered by local farmers and even poor whites who feared losing the fragile security their social position offered. Armed with muskets and driven by terror, they hunted the rebels with relentless force. Clashes erupted in fields and along country roads. Outnumbered and outgunned, Turner's band began to scatter. Some were killed in skirmishes, their bodies left as warnings. Others were captured and dragged into makeshift jails, where interrogations and executions followed swiftly. Turner himself evaded capture, slipping into the dense forests and swamps that crisscrossed Southampton County. For weeks he lived like a shadow, hiding in hollows and caves, sustained by the faith that had inspired him to rise in the first place. The violence of the rebellion did not end with its collapse. In the days that followed, the white response was swift and merciless. Militias and mobs swept through the county, killing not only those suspected of participating, but also enslaved men, women, and children who had no part in the uprising. Some were hanged after hurried trials, while others were executed without ceremony. The bloodletting was indiscriminate, a wave of vengeance meant to reassert control. Historians estimate that while Turner's rebels killed around 60 white men, women, and children, the retaliation took the lives of more than 100 black people, many of them innocent. Southampton became a landscape of fear, its fields littered with bodies, its communities fractured by grief and rage. Throughout these incidents, the deeper terror lay not only in the physical violence, but in what it represented. The rebellion shattered the illusion of control that slaveholders clung to. It exposed the reality that their dominance rested on fear, and that fear could be turned back against them. For the enslaved, the rebellion was both a moment of empowerment and a source of horror, for they knew the reprisals would be devastating. For the white population, it confirmed their worst nightmares that the people they oppressed might one day rise in uncontainable fury. Nat Turner's eventual capture added a final layer of drama. When he was found, hidden in the roots of a tree, he was gaunt but calm, as if resignation had replaced the fire of his visions. His trial was brief, his execution inevitable. Yet even in chains, Turner's presence unsettled his captors. He spoke with composure, framing his rebellion not as madness but as divine mission. His words, recorded by lawyer Thomas Gray, became both testimony and confession, though historians debate how much of it reflects Turner's true voice and how much was shaped by Gray's agenda. Regardless, his legacy was sealed not merely as a murderer or fanatic, but as a symbol of resistance, a figure who embodied the desperation and determination of an enslaved people, pushed beyond endurance. Each incident of the rebellion reveals more than a series of murders. It reveals the collision of two worlds. One was built on domination, convinced of its permanence. The other was built on survival, waiting for a chance to break free. In August 1831, those worlds clashed with an intensity that left scars across Virginia and reverberated through the nation. The rebellion was both an explosion of violence and a mirror, forcing America to confront the contradictions it preferred to ignore. And though the rebellion ended in blood, its shadow would linger, haunting the hills and fields of Southampton for generations to come. The aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion was as much about perception as it was about the events themselves. In Southampton County and across Virginia, the uprising became a prism through which people interpreted their deepest fears, their prejudices, and their hopes. The rebellion was more than a violent episode. It was a shockwave that shook the foundations of society and forced everyone to respond, from enslaved families to local officials, from preachers to distant lawmakers. For white families in Southampton, the rebellion confirmed their darkest suspicions. For years they had whispered of what might happen if the enslaved population ever rose in unison, and now those whispers had taken form in blood. Newspapers captured their panic, describing in lurid detail the murdered families, the axes and knives the silence of homes turned into graves. Survivors spoke of waking to screams, of seeing neighbors slaughtered, of riding out in desperation to warn others. In their eyes, the rebellion was not simply an isolated act, but a revelation that every enslaved person, no matter how loyal they seemed, might be harboring rebellion in their hearts. This paranoia deepened mistrust and hardened the already brutal system of control. Among the enslaved community, reactions were layered with complexity. Some had joined Turner willingly, driven by desperation and faith. Others had stayed away, fearful of the inevitable reprisals. In the days after the rebellion, those who had not participated still suffered, as mobs and militias executed people indiscriminately. Families were torn apart, mothers weeping for sons hanged without trial, children left orphaned. In whispered conversations, many likely debated whether Turner was a hero or a fool, whether his visions had been divine or delusional, whether his rebellion had offered a glimpse of freedom or only invited ruin. Yet even those who condemned the rebellion could not escape its resonance. It had shown, if only for a moment, that the chains could be broken, that fear could be turned back against those who imposed it. Religious leaders wrestled with the rebellion's meaning. For some white preachers, Turner's claim of divine visions was evidence of the dangers of allowing enslaved people access to religious teachings. They thundered from pulpits that Turner was possessed by Satan, a false prophet who had twisted scripture into violence. Others, however, were more unsettled. They recognized that the very texts Turner cited of deliverance, of judgment, of divine wrath were the same ones they themselves preached. If Turner was a madman, then why did his words echo so closely the Bible they revered? The question gnawed at them, even as they worked to reassure their congregations that God still sanctioned order and hierarchy. The press played a decisive role in shaping broader reactions. In Richmond, Washington, and beyond, newspapers covered the rebellion with sensationalism. Headlines screamed of massacres, of savagery, of anarchy lurking in the countryside. These accounts stoked fear not only in Virginia but across the South. Slaveholders in other states tightened their own laws, terrified that Turner's rebellion might inspire copycats. In the North, abolitionists seized on the event to highlight the brutality of slavery itself. To them, the rebellion was not an act of unprovoked violence but a predictable consequence of a system built on oppression. They argued that the bloodshed was proof that slavery could not be maintained without constant violence, and that sooner or later, the enslaved would always resist. Lawmakers in Virginia responded with both fear and calculation. In the months after the rebellion, the state legislature debated whether slavery should be gradually abolished. For a moment, it seemed possible that Turner's uprising had forced Virginia to confront the unsustainability of its system. Yet, the debates ended not in liberation, but in retrenchment. Instead of loosening the chains, lawmakers tightened them. Slave codes grew harsher, restrictions on literacy, assembly, and movement multiplied. Any space for autonomy shrank. Turner's rebellion, intended as a step toward freedom, had ironically brought about greater repression, as white society sought to prevent such an uprising from ever happening again. Psychologists and scholars, looking back, have often interpreted these reactions as evidence of a society in denial. Instead of confronting the moral contradictions of slavery, many whites doubled down, projecting their fear onto the very people they enslaved. The rebellion exposed how fragile the system was, how much it depended on terror to function. Yet, rather than dismantling it, they fortified it, hoping that sheer force could preserve what was already crumbling. For the enslaved, the rebellion became a kind of whispered legend, retold in secret as both warning and inspiration. It showed the price of resistance, but also its possibility. The broader American society was forced to reckon with Turner's rebellion in its own way. For some, it was a symbol of barbarity, proof that African Americans could not be trusted with freedom. For others, it was a stark reminder of the human yearning for liberation, so strong that it would risk everything, even life itself. Turner became a polarizing figure, condemned as a butcher by some, revered as a martyr by others. His name entered the history of American rebellion, not alongside the patriotic revolts celebrated in textbooks, but in the darker margins, where stories of blood and defiance linger. Ultimately, the reactions to the rebellion revealed as much about the society that witnessed it as they did about the event itself. The horror of Southampton was not just that people were killed, but that it exposed the truth. Slavery was a system built on violence, and violence was bound to return to it. For the enslaved, for the enslavers, for the nation, Turner's rebellion became an unshakable reminder that beneath the veneer of order lay a wound that could never fully heal. It was not simply a story of one man's visions, but of an entire society unraveling under the weight of its contradictions. The pursuit of Nat Turner after the rebellion unfolded like a grim hunt through the Virginia countryside, a chase drenched in fear, vengeance, and silence. By late August 1831, the fires of rebellion had burned themselves out, but Turner remained. At large, a shadow in the woods, a name whispered with equal parts terror and reverence. The militia scoured the land, their boots churning the soil, their torches sweeping across cornfields and swamps. Yet Turner slipped through, moving with the quiet precision of a man convinced he still bore a divine mission. For nearly 2 months, he lingered in the margins, unseen but never absent, his presence haunting the county like a ghost that would not rest. Families locked their doors at night, the sound of owls in the woods enough to set nerves aflame. Every rustle in the field seemed a threat, every shadow an omen. Rumors spread that Turner could vanish at will, that he spoke to the wind, that he could not be killed by mortal hands. These whispers, half folklore, half fear, only amplified the terror that had already taken root. The rebellion's violence had ended, but the psychological hold of Turner's name gripped Southampton more tightly than ever. When Turner was finally captured on October 30th, it was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. He was found not leading another wave of rebels, nor storming a homestead, but hiding in a shallow depression beneath the roots of a fallen tree. Exhausted, gaunt, his body betrayed the strain of weeks in hiding. Yet those who saw him noted that his eyes still burned with conviction, as though the visions that had driven him to slaughter had not dimmed. The men who seized him expected resistance, perhaps violence, but Turner submitted calmly, almost serenely, as if surrender itself was part of a divine plan. His trial in November was swift, a theater of justice played out under the gaze of a society desperate to reassert control. Turner was brought into the courtroom in chains, his presence electrifying the air. Ordinary citizens crowded the benches, straining to glimpse the man whose actions had carved terror into their lives. Reporters scribbled furiously, recording not only the words spoken but the atmosphere itself, the tense silence, the darting eyes, the collective weight of judgment pressing down on the room, Turner was asked to explain himself, to account for the carnage. What emerged was not the ravings of a madman, but a quiet, chilling certainty. He spoke of visions, of divine signs, of a mission ordained by God. He described the eclipse of the sun as a signal, the voices he heard as commands. There was no apology in his words, no attempt at justification by earthly standards. Instead, he placed his rebellion in the language of prophecy, of judgment, of biblical wrath. For some in the courtroom, this was proof of madness. For others, it was something far more unsettling, the possibility that Turner truly believed he was an instrument of divine justice. As his testimony spread, reactions sharpened. White citizens pointed to his words as evidence of the danger of literacy and religion among the enslaved, proof that allowing such access could twist minds toward rebellion. Abolitionists, however, seized upon his calm defiance as a kind of martyrdom, a testament to the unbearable weight of bondage. In both cases, Turner's voice echoed louder than the courtroom itself, reverberating through newspapers, pulpits, and political halls. The climax of Turner's story arrived not in his trial, but in his execution. On November 11th, he was led from his cell to the gallows. The day was cold, the air heavy with anticipation. Crowds gathered, their faces etched with a mix of anger, curiosity, and grim satisfaction. For many, this was not merely the punishment of a criminal, but the exorcism of a haunting. They wanted to see Turner broken, to watch his body stripped of the power his name still carried. And yet, when he appeared, thin but composed, the murmurs fell into silence. Accounts of the execution vary in detail, but agree on the same point. Turner met his death with remarkable calm. He neither begged nor raged, offering no final confession that might absolve or explain. Instead, he stood as if already beyond the reach of those who condemned him. When the rope was fastened and the trap released, his body fell, and with it, a chapter of terror seemed to close. But even in death, Turner defied closure. His body was treated with contempt, dissected, displayed, a warning to others. Yet this desecration only deepened the aura of dread, as if his captors feared that even in death, his spirit might rise again. The execution did not end the rebellion's hold on the American mind. If anything, it amplified it. The image of Turner at the gallows became a symbol, its meaning shifting depending on who invoked it. To slaveholders, it was a reminder of vigilance, of the necessity of harsher control. To abolitionists, it was a rallying cry, a stark embodiment of the desperation bred by slavery. For the enslaved themselves, it was both a wound and a whisper of hope, the cost of resistance laid bare, but also its possibility etched in blood. The climax of Nat Turner's story was not simply his capture or execution, but the way his rebellion forced an entire society to confront itself. In the silence after his death, Virginia trembled with questions it could not answer. Could faith truly drive a man to such extremes? Could a system built on bondage survive without constant fear? Could the desire for freedom ever be fully extinguished? The rebellion had ended. Turner was gone, but the echoes of his visions lingered, haunting the South like a specter that refused to fade. What made the climax so potent was not the finality of Turner's end, but its lack of resolution. His death was supposed to restore order, to reassure those who feared him that the danger was gone. Instead, it exposed the fragility of that order. The gallows silenced Turner's voice, but not the questions he had raised, nor the terror he had unleashed. The system of slavery remained intact, but its cracks had been laid bare, illuminated by the blood spilled in Southampton County. And in that exposure lay the seeds of future conflict, the faint rumblings of a reckoning still to come. In the end, the climax of Nat Turner's rebellion was not only the image of a man dying at the gallows, but the realization that his rebellion had unsettled the foundations of a society built on violence. It was a moment suspended in time, drenched in horror and mystery, where history bent under the weight of one man's conviction. The silence that followed was not peace, but a pause before the next storm, a reminder that what had been awakened could never be fully put to rest. The rebellion had ended, the blood washed away by rain, the echoes of screams swallowed by the earth. Yet the story of Nat Turner did not rest. What remained was not merely a record of violence, but a wound stitched into the memory of Virginia, a mark that could never be erased. In the months and years after his death, his name lingered like a whisper in darkened rooms, carried on the wind across the fields where he once moved unseen. The soil itself seemed to carry the imprint of his footsteps, the memory of the rebellion locked within its silence. The physical remnants of Turner's existence were erased with deliberate cruelty. His body, once animated by conviction, was cut apart, pieces scattered, his skull passed from hand to hand like a trophy. It was an act meant to strip him of dignity, to deny him the sanctity of rest. Yet these very acts betrayed an undercurrent of fear. If he was only a man, why was his body treated as though it carried a power even in death? Why the need to destroy what should have been lifeless? The dismemberment became an unspoken acknowledgement. Nat Turner had transcended flesh. He had become an idea, and ideas cannot be buried. In the broader culture, his rebellion reshaped conversations in ways both immediate and lasting. White society doubled down on repression. Laws tightened. Literacy was forbidden to the enslaved. Gatherings were restricted. Religion was monitored. Fear hardened into policy, and policy into chains. Yet these measures, born from terror, also revealed fragility. A society confident in its stability does not fear words, does not fear prayers, does not fear the silent stirrings of thought. Turner's rebellion showed that slavery was not an unshakable system, but a precarious one balanced on violence and control. Among abolitionists, Turner's memory was more complicated. Some saw him as a martyr, a man who struck at his oppressors with a clarity that no rhetoric could match. Others hesitated, uneasy with the brutality of his methods. Yet whether embraced or condemned, his rebellion forced recognition of a truth long denied: that slavery was not merely an institution but a war, waged daily upon the enslaved. Turner's uprising made visible the blood already embedded in the system, the violence that sustained it. In that sense, the rebellion was not an aberration, but a mirror held up to American society. For the enslaved, the epilogues whispered in hushed tones carried a different weight. Turner's name was both fear and inspiration. Parents warned their children never to speak of him aloud, yet around fires and in fields, his story traveled like forbidden scripture. Some said he was a prophet whose mission would be completed by others. Some believed he had not died at all, that his body was a decoy, that he had vanished into the swamps to await God's call once more. In this way, Nat Turner became more than a man. He became a legend, part of a hidden tradition of resistance carried silently from generation to generation. The epilogue of Turner's rebellion is also an epilogue of questions. Was he insane, driven by delusion, or was he a prophet touched by something beyond human comprehension? Was his violence an atrocity, or was it the inevitable expression of a system that thrived on brutality? History offers no simple answers, only the uneasy recognition that both may be true. What unsettles most is not the blood Turner spilled, but the clarity of his conviction. His calm defiance in court, his refusal to beg at the gallows. These moments suggest a man unshaken in his purpose, a man who saw himself as part of a story larger than his own life. It is this certainty that lingers, that refuses to be explained away. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, Turner's name carries weight. His rebellion is retold in classrooms, in books, in films, each version refracted through the lens of its time. To some, he is a murderer. To others, a revolutionary. To many, he is an enigma, a figure who resists simple categorization. What remains constant is the unease he inspires, the way his story disrupts easy narratives of good and evil, victim and aggressor. In the silence after the telling, listeners are left to wrestle with their own reflections, their own sense of justice and fear. The hills and fields of Southampton still hold the silence of that summer. Trees have grown where bodies once fell. Grass sways where blood once stained the soil. Life has continued, but the ground remembers. Those who walk there sometimes speak of a strange heaviness, a sense of presence lingering just beyond perception. Perhaps it is nothing more than imagination. Or perhaps it is the echo of a story that refuses to end, the memory of a man who believed he was chosen to remake the world. History buries many names, but some resist the weight of time. Nat Turner is one of them. And so the epilogue is not closure, but continuation. The rebellion is over, the gallows silent, the courtroom emptied, yet the questions remain. Could it happen again? Could conviction drive another to rise from the shadows, to shatter the fragile peace of a society built on suffering? Each retelling carries with it this quiet warning that history is not past but present, that the seeds of rebellion still linger in the soil. Turner's voice may be silent, but the silence itself speaks, and it is not easily forgotten. This is the legacy of Nat Turner, a story carved in blood, silenced by rope, and resurrected in whispers. A man erased in body, but immortalized in fear, faith, and memory. His rebellion remains not only a moment of terror, but a mirror reflecting the brutality of bondage, the desperation of the oppressed, and the terrifying power of belief. The epilogue leaves us not with answers, but with unease, and perhaps that is its truest legacy. For some stories are not meant to comfort. They are meant to haunt,